Welcome to Birds.Bees.Bodies, a Planned Parenthood of Southeast and North Florida podcast where we break barriers, tear down stigmas, and promote open discussions on sexual and reproductive health. Get the buzz on topics from puberty to menopause, contraception to conception. No topic is off limits. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into a judgment-free zone to promote sexual wellness.
Welcome to another episode of Birds.Bees.Bodies. We are back again, and this month we're talking about something extremely important, Mental Health Awareness Month. I am your host, Michelle Quesada, the Vice President of Communications for Planned Parenthood of Southeast and North Florida. This is a podcast brought to you by Planned Parenthood of Southeast and North Florida. And this month, we're excited to talk about mental health awareness, how important it is. And we've dedicated this podcast to talk about understanding trauma. And in order to do that, we've invited on our Behavioral Health Program Director, Janet Santiago, and one of our behavioral health interns, Trey, who is also going to be joining us for this discussion. So I'll start off just kind of letting Janet jump in, talk a little bit about yourself, your background, how'd you get involved with mental health and behavioral health?
Hi, thank you, Michelle. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to join you. My name is Janet Santiago. I am a licensed clinical social worker, certified clinical trauma professional, and certified DBT clinician. I have been in this field for almost 15 years, working with all age groups, spanning the lifespan starting at age 3 up to age 99. And trauma has been my focus. All types of trauma, how it impacts folks, and how we can recover from it, with the overarching goal of healing the generational traumas so that future generations have a chance at a healthier lifestyle.
Hi, I'm Trey. I am a behavioral health intern. I'm currently in my master's program for clinical social work. A little background about me. Before Planned Parenthood, I have never worked with anybody other than those living with HIV, which has been my focus for about 5 years now. Everywhere from telling people that they are HIV positive to even helping them find housing. So anywhere in between. And that's where I'm currently at. I don't have all the fancy credentials like Janet does yet, but I'm here.
Wonderful. We appreciate you, Trey, and the experience and just, overall perspective that you join and bring to us in this discussion. So we want to talk about, trauma. It's not an easy thing to talk about, right? There's many different types of traumas out there. Trauma comes in many forms. But I guess first, let's jump in to talk about what is trauma, understanding what is trauma.
So trauma, a general definition of that is basically a psychological response that a person has to an event, or it could be a series of events, multiple events, that cause deeply distressing and disturbing emotions and thoughts, a distorted perception, a feeling of unsafety. Now, what I can tell you is that trauma is very subjective. So trauma is going to be different for everyone. What may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you, and vice versa. But at the end of the day, it is the individual's psychological response to a distressing event. That is overall trauma.
And you mentioned something earlier, Janet, that kind of stuck with me. You talked about how you've worked with people as young as 3 years old and up to 99 years old. And so that got me thinking, because I have a 2-year-old, actually turns 2 this month. And, I got me thinking about trauma existing in the youngest form, and what trauma can exist that early in age. How do you remember trauma, And so maybe you could chat a little bit about that, Trey. And if you have experience as well, what is your what can be your earliest memory of trauma, for people? And I know that varies.
Well, that's a weird question, because actually trauma doesn't even have to be attached to a memory. It can be attached just to an overall feeling. So people experience trauma may not even remember what was traumatic to them. It can even be just they have a feeling that something happened before and they can't quite explain it. I know there are even people who are infant psychologists who work with infants trying to help them through, and they help with those kind of traumas, because let's be honest, even birth can be traumatic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so many things, you just brought up so many things to me, even as a child being in a car accident, that could be traumatic for you. And then you have can develop a fear, moving forward, or just a feeling overall. So there's so many different things. How does it manifest? Like, how do you know? Okay, because we can all experience trauma in our lives, right? And some people are much better at coping with it and moving on, or kind of like dealing with it. However you do, file it in your mind of, this is a feeling that I attach to this, and I've been able to accept it, learn from it, and kind of get past it. But there's different ways that trauma manifests. Like, when is it a problem? When do you know, like, okay, this is a traumatic situation that I need to seek help for?
So trauma can manifest in many different ways, not just emotionally, right? So we typically jump to the emotional manifestations: anxiety, depression, irritability, those kind of things. And even the cognitive symptoms like difficulty concentrating or confusion, flashbacks, right? Like a lot of people that experience trauma have flashbacks. So re-experiencing the event as though it were happening again. But what most people don't know is that, as Trey said, the body keeps the score. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk that really describes the impact trauma has on physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, even vaginal discomfort. There are so many different ways that your body manifests this trauma. And as Trey said, it doesn't necessarily need to be linked to a memory, especially for those that have had traumas early on in life. The body will remember it, and there may be things that might trigger that specific memory, but many times it's just the physical reaction and not necessarily the memory that comes up.
Wow. So what kind of different traumas are there?
There are about 5 different types of trauma. There's acute, which is a single incident, such as, like you said earlier, car accident or, an assault, natural disaster. There's chronic traumas, which are repeated and prolonged exposures to highly stressful events, such as domestic violence, bullying, any kind of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, that kind of thing. We have complex trauma, which is exposure to multiple varied traumatic experiences. So they don't have to be the same experience. They can be multiple different types of experience. So maybe you had a car accident and a few weeks later you got bullied, and a few weeks after that you were sexually assaulted. Multiple incidents that will lead to complex trauma. We have vicarious trauma, also known as secondary trauma, and that's the trauma that is experienced by someone who is in direct contact with the traumatized person. For example, caregivers, clinicians, therapists. We ourselves sometimes experience vicarious trauma, and that's when we know we need to take a step back and reach out to our colleagues, that kind of thing. So any exposure to another person's trauma and repeated exposure to that, hearing them talk about it or having to care for them. First responders experience this quite a bit because they're constantly going out to traumatic situations. So we'll see a lot of vicarious trauma there. And then finally, trauma regarding reproductive health. So inability to reproduce, contraception, any pregnancy, fertility issues, that kind of thing. Those can all lead to trauma. So there's different types of trauma, but those are primarily the ones that we categorize them into.
And that's so interesting, because I feel like most people, when they think of trauma, they think of something that it's very obvious to them, right? They're aware of it. Like, people who are survivors of mass shootings, like obviously that's a traumatic experience, things of that nature, but that's not always the case. Like there could be underlying things that happen that are not as obvious to you. What are some examples of that?
I was going to say, even like the way you were raised can be traumatic. You hear so much of people, they're like, oh, I didn't know that wasn't normal until I became an adult. I didn't know that everyone didn't sleep on couches for the first 10 years of their lives. So it can even be things that you don't even understand are trauma until later on.
There's the perception that the person has, right? So, for example, perceived abandonment. Someone who feels that they've been abandoned, although they necessarily haven't. And we have to take into consideration that children, a lot of times, are very egocentric, right? Everything happens because of them. If mom and dad are fighting, it's because I spilled the milk, not because mom and dad have a bad relationship, that kind of thing. So many times when we experience trauma in childhood, we tend to blame ourselves. We tend to believe that it's our fault. If we would have done something different, that wouldn't have happened. Or, the person, mom and dad, aren't really spending time with me because they don't love me, not because they have 2 jobs to pay the bills, that kind of thing. So it's that perception of the trauma that the person is experiencing. I believe I was abandoned, so I must have been. And that's part of what we do in counseling, is help them identify what are some of those distorted perceptions that we picked up in childhood that allowed this trauma to continue. Let's reframe them, let's heal from them, let's allow the brain to process, and that's how we move towards healing trauma.
Yeah. And part of that, I imagine a big part of it is combating the stigma that comes along with getting help and talking about it and even acknowledging trauma, right? Because a lot of people grew up a certain way. Like even in my household, like, we were never a household where we sought out mental health, or we just kind of figured out like this is just life and you just kind of deal with it. But as you get older, you learn more, you read more, there's so much information on the internet, you learn, well, these aren't like healthy ways to cope with, with these feelings. There are healthier ways out there to cope with these feelings. So, can you share just like doing what you do every day, helping people, figuring out what's the best form of treatment for them, what kind of support do they need? How much of a battle is that when you're trying to combat the stigma of even picking up the phone and calling someone and getting help?
It's a lot of the battle, honestly. So many people come to therapy and they go, I don't even know what therapy is because I've just been told we don't need it. I don't want it. Even speaking personally, when I told my mom I was going to therapy, even though I was going to school to be a therapist, she goes, why are you in therapy? I'm like, well, Mom, you were there. So stigma's a big part of it.
Yeah, it's almost like other people think that because you go to therapy, there must be something wrong with you. But in fact, because you go to therapy, you're working on yourself, right? You're figuring out yourself. It's not different than going to the doctor for, your knee hurting or whatever the case is.
Exactly. And I always tell clients to remember the world is moving faster than our brains can keep up with. Evolution took us to this point, but we're moving at such a high speed with phones and tablets and social media. Our brains are like trying to catch up at work that it wasn't prepared to do.
So I can tell you, as social workers, one of the values that I was taught in school that I hold on to this day in my career is starting where the client is, right? Because we are working with so many different populations. And when we're talking about trauma, we have to take into consideration that culturally that can mean something different. Generationally, that can mean something different, right? So we really have to take into account the person that's sitting in front of us, what they deem as traumatic and not necessarily what we deem as traumatic, right? And I'll give you an example. If I have a client in front of me who culturally spanking is part of the way that we raise our kids and that's just what we do and that kind of thing, and then I come in with, well, part of trauma is physical abuse and corporal punishment can be considered physical abuse. I've now created trauma for this person that didn't even have it because now they're like, wait a minute, I was being abused. And now I've created a line of thinking that can lead to some traumatic emotions and really disturb this person's perception. So I have to be very careful and take all of these things into account. What's their environment? What's their culture? What generation are they from? As we approach the trauma and we work on it.
And you mentioned earlier when you were going through the different types of trauma, you talked about reproductive health and things that you can come across in your journey with reproductive health. Obviously, not a lot of people know that Planned Parenthood offers behavioral health. We've been offering it for several years now. Most of us know us as a reproductive health care agency, a healthcare center. And so one of the things that you mentioned was that there are many traumas that can be associated with contraception or just both birth control in general, or trying to get pregnant or a miscarriage. Can you talk about that?
When it comes to contraception, or even abortion or any of these things, any of the services that we provide, one of the things we have to consider is that a lot of the BIPOC population specifically has a major mistrust of the healthcare system, of medical procedures and the care that they're going to receive. So when someone who has been, let's say, sexually abused, right, they've experienced that trauma, chances are they're going to have a much harder time going to a gynecologist or anyone that deals with reproductive health, because now we're talking about their sexual organs, right? And that can be re-traumatizing. Becoming pregnant, right? So that can lead to anxiety, depression, PTSD, all these other hormones that are in the body, along with the mental trauma that they may have experienced throughout childhood, throughout life. Am I going to be a good parent? Am I going to raise my child the same way? All these questions that tend to come up. There's a lot of heightened emotional responses and fear that comes along with, contraception, reproductive health, abortions, all of those issues, as well as intimacy and desire, right? So a lot of people that experience trauma have difficulty with intimate relationships because, again, that trust has been broken, right? There's an emotional detachment. Part of trauma, one of the symptoms of trauma is that our alarm system in our brain that tells us that we're in danger is activated. And once that switch is flipped, it gets stuck. And part of therapy is helping you to unstick that switch. But until we get there, you're constantly afraid. You're constantly mistrusting and waiting for the next bad thing to happen. People have a difficulty coming to us or any healthcare provider really once there's been some sort of trauma, especially a physical type of trauma, and then connecting with their loved ones, having those intimate relationships, having a sexual desire. If you've been sexually abused, a lot of times you don't have sexual desire, right? Or even emotional. And let's move away from sexual abuse, even emotional or verbal abuse. If I'm told all the time by my loved ones that I'm fat, that I'm ugly, that I'm dumb, that I'm this, that I'm that, that I'm the other, how am I ever going to feel sexy? How am I ever going to want to engage in any kind of vulnerable sexual act with anyone if I don't feel like I'm good enough? Right? So trauma can really impact us in so many different ways, from relationships to physical, and just all of the choices that we make in life.
And you mentioned a lot of things that made me think of like self-inflicted traumas, right? Like that's a thing as well. Like people create these images of themselves, right? And that could affect all these other areas that you just mentioned.
Right, absolutely. And one of the things that Trey mentioned earlier was, where you grew up. So in the book that I mentioned, The Body Keeps the Score, that's one of the things that they talk about is how someone who grows up in an unhealthy environment, right? Although it's traumatic, although it's not an environment that they're happy in, they know it. They're comfortable. They know what tomorrow's going to bring, right? They know that tomorrow I've got to kind of hide and duck and dodge, that kind of thing. If I heal that trauma, what does that mean for me? What is my next day going to look like? What does life look like if I'm not broken? And then that leads to more trauma, self-inflicted trauma. I deserve this trauma, right? Or the self-fulfilling prophecies of, I don't want this to change because I'm too afraid of what's going to happen. So I'm going to keep engaging in those relationships. That's why we see people in domestic violence go from one domestic violence relationship to another to another. It's not because they want it, right? We've heard so many people, well, they must like being hit. That's not it. They don't like being hit. They just don't know anything else. They know what to expect. They know what being hit feels like and how to recover from that. They don't know the opposite. So we tend to go, we know because it feels safe to us.
Yeah, it's something familiar. We already have learned how to somewhat adapt to that environment, that hostile environment. It's almost like that saying, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah, the unknown. But if you're brave and you step out for a second and take a chance, right? Like you never know what's waiting for you on the other side or how great things can be.
Healing from trauma really is about becoming a new person, right? About removing all those limitations, the chains, the boundaries, all these restrictions that were put on you by other people and by trauma and by society. And it's becoming your most genuine self, which can be a very terrifying thing because that also comes with a lot of power and control and, self-accountability, and all these things. If I don't have someone else to blame, if I don't have my trauma to blame for my poor choices, then I really have to take accountability. But the beautiful thing is that also means you have total control and power over your own life. And you can be whoever you want to be without other people's influence taking control of that.
Yeah, I was going to say it's freedom. And that's what a lot of people, they don't know that freedom.
That's incredible.
Freedom's scary.
It is for someone who, because there's two parts to this, right? It's one, recognizing the red flags in your own life, right? Recognizing the things in your life that you realize, okay, this is something that I'm not okay with and I need to get help with or talk to someone or whatever that looks like for you, right? But then there's also us seeing our loved ones and our friends and, people that are near and dear to us go through things. I know it's not the same for everyone, but what are things that you might notice either about yourself or notice about others where you're thinking, okay, like just something's not emotionally sitting right with this person, or something's just not right with this person as far as like their happiness, their energy levels, their, just their overall outlook on life. Like, how do you know when it's time? And I know it's very delicate, right, on how to approach that and how to get someone interested in even talking about it. But how do you start to recognize, like, okay, this is something that you can benefit from counseling, you can benefit from exploring your options?
For yourself, the number one thing I always preach is one, mostly everyone can benefit from some kind of counseling, even if it's what I call a maintenance check of coming in like once a month, once every 2 months, just to say, hey, how you doing? But also recognizing, like, when you feel different, when your energy level's down or way high, you recognize when you just feel off, and it's a constant feeling. That's what I always tell people. It's like, if you feel off, then something's going on. Your body's trying to tell you something.
It's like the "you're not you when you're hungry" commercials from Snickers.
Right.
Like, there's something going on.
Yeah, when there's something, and people, especially when other people recognize it and they say, "Hey, if they keep asking you, "Hey, are you okay?" That's usually a sign something's going on.
One of the things loved ones can look out for is specifically fear, hypervigilance, right? Someone who always turns you down, they don't really want to leave their house ever. Or if you do get them to leave their house, they want to head back quickly. Or you go to restaurants or something like that, and they have to sit in a corner with their back against the wall. Nobody can get behind me, right? Like there's a lot of self-preservation going on. There's a lot of hypervigilance going on. So if you're recognizing those kind of things, usually the person has experienced something terrifying. They've experienced something traumatic, and they are reacting out of fear. And you can see it. A lot of times you can see it on their eyes, right? When you're having certain conversations, they're like, oh no, I don't want to go there. Or they'll blank out, that kind of thing. So there's certain behaviors that we look out for, fears, pessimism, difficulty even talking about the future, because one of the areas of the brain that's impacted by trauma is the Broca area. The Broca area has to do with our imagination. So if that imagination center of your brain has been impacted, chances are you're not really having dreams about your future or anything like that, or setting goals for yourself, because you can't envision it, because we need imagination to envision those things. So if you're not able to envision a happy future, exactly, because your brain is stuck in that traumatic experience. Even if it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, your brain is still stuck in that time. Your body has continued to grow, but your mind has not. Okay, so you're stuck in this place, and we're just repeating the same patterns over and over, maybe talking about the same traumatic experiences over and over. These are some of the things that we tend to look out for, because that'll tell us that a person is stuck in a different time and they're not necessarily here with us.
This reminds me too of like, I used to be in a very, very high stress career, as you all know, as a journalist. And this reminds me of like that type of like running and gunning, like just fight or flight mentality constantly. Like people who don't realize like they're in this high stress environment because that's all they've ever known. Like they think this is all you can do, until you take yourself out of it and learn like, oh no, that was very traumatizing. Like that was not probably the best way to live or kind of go about my life, every single day. And we haven't even gotten into talking about like, actual diagnoses and mental health diagnoses and things like that. Really, we've been focusing on symptoms. How can we treat, the underlying issues that are causing these symptoms, or what treatments are available, what therapies are available?
So you have your basics, right? The therapies that we use for anxiety, depression. So that's your cognitive behavioral therapy. Your DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which teaches you emotion regulation, interpersonal skills, things like that. For trauma specifically, we have EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which focuses on processing and integrating traumatic memories. So it allows your brain to heal the lesions that were created by the trauma. There are other trauma-focused therapies like brain spotting that we offer as well. But aside from the therapy techniques that we use in session, there's also things like yoga. yoga has been one of the main techniques that are used with war veterans, because yoga has been proven to rewire the connections in the brain and to heal those lesions as well. Deep breathing and mindfulness meditation, as simple as those things sound, they're actually re-regulating your central nervous system. And one of the things that we have to look at is the chemistry behind all this, right? So trauma results in high levels of cortisol in your brain. Cortisol is that chemical that makes us feel physically ill, emotionally, mentally, so on and so forth. To combat that, we need to focus on activities that the person can do to release dopamine and serotonin, which will fight off that cortisol and lower that. So there's exercise, right? And like yoga, the deep breathing, journaling, all of these things. But in therapy itself, we process a lot of these things and we identify some of these tasks that the person can continue outside of those therapeutic sessions to continue the healing of the brain.
I want you to go back for a second to EMDR and brain spotting, because those are two not too new, but relatively new services that you've started offering in your program. Very sought after forms of therapy for trauma, proven, evidence-based, proven therapies that where people have actually seen the change right in the brain before and after these therapies. Talk about that. How does this therapy work? How does EMDR work? How long is it? I know we offer it at a very affordable price compared to other private healthcare providers out there, mental health providers out there. So I want people to be able to learn more about this and take advantage of it, because it does work and it does help people.
Right. So part of EMDR is using what's called bilateral stimulation, which are sounds that a person will listen to. It's a rhythmic sound. And it's also, if you're doing it in person, there can be a light, but a lot of times, since we do it virtual, there's a platform that we use and there's a ball right in front of them that they're going to follow with their eyes back and forth, right? As they allow their brain to move through the traumas. Now, there's some work that's done with the clinician before that bilateral stimulation session happens, such as identifying a timeline of those traumas. So let's just jot down a log of what were all the traumas and when did they happen. We don't have to go into detail because that processing will happen through the bilateral stimulation. So that's why EMDR is really good for those people that A, can't remember some things, or B, just verbally don't feel comfortable processing, because there's not a lot of that has to happen in EMDR. You can do as much or as little as you want verbally processing. But once the clinician has an idea of what we're going to work on, then we move into bilateral stimulation. Again, they're listening to a sound, they're following a light or a ball in front of them, and the clinician will have them start with a memory and just allow the brain to move where it's going to move. Just think where it's going to think and just listen to the sound and follow the light. Okay, those are techniques that you're doing that's healing your brain. It's actually causing a physical healing as well as reprocessing those. So it's moving these traumatic memories from one part of the brain to another, to your long-term memory. So you'll remember it. You just won't have the same emotional reactions to it. You won't have the same perception behind it. Okay. As far as how long that can take, it's really very, very different. Depending on the acuity of the person's trauma, the complexity of it, and EMDR and brain spotting. Brain spotting is also similar to EMDR. It just uses a different type of, we don't use a platform. The clinician's actually using hand movements and verbal directives. But they both achieve the same thing. They are hour-long sessions, yes, and they are used not only for trauma, but for anxiety, for depression, for OCD. So we can use them for other mental health issues as well. But most people tend to come to us for specifically the trauma that they want to address.
And if you want to learn more about it, you can go on our website, ppsenfl.org, on our mental health, behavioral health page. All the information is on there about EMDR, brain spotting, how you can make an appointment, all that good stuff. Before we run out of time, I do think it's important for us to talk about how we can support someone who's survived trauma. What are some of the things, like I hear all the time that a lot of people who have been through traumatic experiences, like their closest loved ones to them, their friends, their family, don't believe them or don't validate their feelings. Like, how can we support people who have been through these types of scenarios, and how do we combat stigma so that more people are able to seek the help that they need?
One of the things that individuals can do is we can create a safe space, right? We don't necessarily have to know what to say or how to help the person. And we don't necessarily have to do anything. We just need to be able to create a space where the person feels physically and emotionally safe. Because remember that trauma impacts our sense of security. So we're always feeling threatened. First thing we can do, whether we're clinicians or, just a person's loved one, create a safe space. Just let them be there with you without pressuring them to talk about what happened or get over what happened, move on, any of those things. We need to listen and validate. And validating can be something as simple as, that sounds like it was really hard. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. I know it couldn't have been easy, right? It's not necessarily having to give advice, because what can you possibly say to someone that's going to make them feel better about the fact that they've been traumatized? Nothing. Just the fact that I'm here for you and you have every right to feel the way that you do. Resources are a big piece. We don't have a lot of resources for trauma survivors, right? You mentioned EMDR. EMDR is something that can be very, very costly, which is why we took it on. Right? There are many clinicians that are charging $1,500 a session for EMDR. We don't do that because we know how impactful it can be to heal that trauma through EMDR. We just want to offer this to as many people as possible, to make it as affordable as possible. And that is one way that we can support our survivors, is making sure that they have access to those resources. Training, education, we tend to go out and do a lot of education. I do presentations on understanding trauma in community libraries, things like that, just making sure that the awareness is there. And then finally, policy reform. Advocating for these laws and policies to change so that trauma survivors can receive the mental health support, they can receive the protections against abuse, that they are aware of the resources that the government also provides, right? Like the state of Florida provides funding for trauma survivors to receive mental health counseling, to relocate if they want to. And most people don't know that. So they're not taking advantage of those resources, and then they're just living with the results of the trauma. And I couldn't even say living with it, they're suffering with it.
How much do we charge for a session of EMDR?
$75 if you're self-pay. And if you do have insurance, we are able to bill your insurance for an hour session.
Yeah. So this is an investment in yourself and being able to feel better, be the best version of yourself, and just live your life. It's incredible that these types of therapies are out there, that they've been created, and that they work. I want to thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion. I know that there are a couple of great events happening if you're in the Palm Beach County area within our library systems, where Janet's going to be talking about understanding trauma and offering workshops. We have all that information on our social media accounts. So at PP Senfl, PPSENFL, if you search us on Instagram, on Facebook. I appreciate you all so much for being a part of this podcast. Mental Health Awareness Month is so important. I know we're going to be doing another podcast on mental health in a few weeks, on perinatal support and just kind of all the mental health aspects that go into, trying to get pregnant, having a child, parenting, going through miscarriage, possibly going through an abortion, all the things that might impact your mental health, in those different phases of life when you're trying to become a parent.
What I can add for Planned Parenthood's behavioral health, as coming in for someone who didn't even know Planned Parenthood did behavioral health, coming in for years of experience working in the social services field, this is a great team to come and see. They're amazing. Janet, the way she talks here is the way she talks with clients, with us as coworkers. They're just a wonderful team. So I really encourage everyone to consider coming and seeing us and taking care of your mental health, whether it's with us or not, because mental health is health in general.
And honestly, the last thing I would like to add is a reminder that we are here to help you get your power back. And that's what this is really about. Getting your power back and feeling your most genuine self and healing from all those things that make you feel not you. So we're going to start where you are, and we're going to make sure you get to where you want to be.
We appreciate you listening to our Birds.Bees.Bodies podcast. We continue to try to break stigmas, break down barriers, and have real conversations about real reproductive and mental health care. Thank you all so much.